Disc 2. John Major certainly had enormous problems with the European issue, and the extraordinary pressures he had to withstand have to be taken into account when drawing up the balance sheet of his premiership. On a personal level, I've always liked him, but getting him to talk publicly about Mrs. Thatcher was not a simple matter. Fortunately, in the summer of 2002, I met him by chance walking down Piccadilly. He appeared to be delighted to see me, and to the obvious consternation of the plainclothes policeman who was accompanying him, stopped to engage me in animated discussion. While the policeman anxiously scanned the small crowd which immediately began to form, Mr. Major gave the impression that he had all the time in the world. He was a striking advertisement of the joys of not being in office, and yes, he would be happy to talk, although some of it might have to be off the record. I was struck once again by Mr. Major's charm. On television he often looks rather strained, as if he would prefer to be somewhere else. In ordinary life he could strike up an instant rapport, usually helped by a firm handshake or a tactile gesture of some sort. I remember when I met him soon after he became Prime Minister, he responded quickly to my suggestion that he should give us the details of his speech the next day. Throwing an arm round my back and grabbing me by the neck, he smilingly declined, even for an old friend like you. It was an unusual but effective way of demonstrating his warmth. As a politician, it was Mr. Major's fate to be underestimated. He could be very formidable indeed. Even out of office, though, his diary was very full, and it was only in April the following year that we would finally meet for the promised chat, and even then he would not agree to his remarks being on the record until we had gone through the transcript some months later. He was anxious not to add to the problems of the current Conservative leadership, but he was conscious, too, that in the past he had pulled his punches about Mrs. Thatcher. He does not hate her, this is not Mr. Major's style, but he is highly critical of the destabilising effect she had on his leadership. We met at his new flat, which from the 6th floor looks out onto an impressive sweep of the River Thames. I mentioned that he had an even better view than the one from his old friend Geoffrey Archer's flat at a different point on the river bank, but Mr. Major only smiled. With Geoffrey still in jail, and with his view therefore restricted, it was not perhaps the most tactful of remarks. 6 years after his departure from Downing Street, Mr. Major was prepared to tell me how Mrs. Thatcher and her supporters had made his life extremely difficult. He had been particularly annoyed at the way they would claim she had been a consistent Eurosceptic. Mr. Major gave her acceptance of the Single European Act as an example. There were gains in it, he said. Installing the single market was a big gain, but it remained an integrationist measure. Without the single market, you could not have had the other moves towards integration, towards a single currency or anything else. I put to Mr. Major the argument Mrs. Thatcher would use, that the problem with the Single European Act was the way it was interpreted. Mr. Major conceded that the European Commission had stretched their powers beyond what was expected. They put forward regulations under health and safety measures which had nothing to do with free trade. But Mr. Major then added with obvious feeling, "Are we to believe that the Prime Minister who negotiated the Single European Act did not know what it meant?" He was clearly irritated by the way, on this and other European issues, Mrs. Thatcher had been prepared to blame the advice she had received at the time. She had the same gift, he told me, that Elizabeth I had, of shifting the blame for unpopular things onto other shoulders. It is time to consider the breakdown in relations between Mrs. Thatcher and the 2 other men who would serve as her Chancellor of the Exchequer, Nigel Lawson and Sir Geoffrey Howe. As with Mr. Heseltine and with Mr. Major, once again Europe was the issue at the heart of these disputes. The Prime Minister is the First Lord of the Treasury. It says so on the polished brass plate on the door of number 10. Most of those who have occupied the post would no doubt wish the inscription could be in even larger letters, and that their neighbour, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, would pay it more attention. Those with a recent interest in politics might imagine that it is only since Tony Blair became Prime Minister and Gordon Brown came to operate from next door that the occupants of these posts have appeared to be at each other's throats. But the struggle between the head of government and the minister charged with looking after the nation's finances has an almost timeless air. It is as if the very nature of these two jobs has a way of pitting one against the other. For the skillful Prime Minister, there can be a straightforward way round the problem. Never appoint a rival to number 11. Mr. Blair did not have that option. Whatever else may have been agreed at that famous dinner at Granita, Mr. Brown was certainly promised the keys to number 11 if Labour won the general election. In return, he gave Mr. Blair a clear run in the leadership contest. Mrs. Thatcher was more fortunate. She appointed Sir Geoffrey Howe, Nigel Lawson, and John Major. She did not believe that any of them could pose a real threat. Of these relationships, the strangest was the one between Mrs. Thatcher and Sir Geoffrey Howe. In personality and temperament, they could hardly have been more different. If she could be compared with an operatic diva capable of hitting the highest notes, he was more like a bear with a big brain, treating emotions like honey, not something to be shared with strangers. Over the years he put up with Mrs. Thatcher. When she was cross, he did not hit back. When she raged, he looked mildly displeased. They were together for 15 years. Sir Geoffrey is proud of their partnership, sees it as by far the most rewarding part of his professional life, and is disappointed that his work on policy is not more widely recognised. Sir Geoffrey is a very British politician. You could not imagine him flourishing outside the conventions of Westminster politics. Having lunch with him can be a strain, if only because he speaks so softly. Dennis Healey, who was for some years Sir Geoffrey's opposite number, famously described being attacked by him as like being savaged by a dead sheep. Yet beneath his woolly exterior, Sir Geoffrey Howe was a formidable force. He was one of the key figures behind the ism which became known as Thatcherism, and his controversial budget in 1981, when he put up taxes despite being in the middle of a recession, was a brave achievement. An extraordinary insight into the early relationship between Mrs. Thatcher and Sir Geoffrey is provided by Michael Portello. For a long time he was one of her favourites and would never publicly criticise her, but at the time when he was coming to the conclusion that he did not want to stand again for Parliament, I talked to him in his office at Westminster. Michael Portello was a young member of the Conservative Research Department during Mrs. Thatcher's first election campaign in 1979. His job was to keep her informed of what the press was saying. Often her reactions in private were rather wild, but these would later be modified in public. Mr. Portello would know that for her a friendly, positive reaction was what she wanted. A sentence beginning with yes would often do the trick. "Yes, Mrs. Thatcher," the 22-year-old Mr. Portello would say, and then make sure that his written advice on the line she should take was far more sober than the line she had suggested. He was surprised that Geoffrey Howe would adopt a quite different response. "No," he would say firmly, risking an immediate confrontation. The men she liked tended to be dashing and glamorous. Cecil Parkinson fitted the bill perfectly, whereas, Mr. Portello told me, Geoffrey was kind of mumbling and sort of old womanish. She hated that. Mr. Portello remembered an occasion when they were amused to learn that Karl Marx's granddaughter, still alive and living in London, had decided to vote Conservative. Her picture appeared in the papers and afforded one of the rare moments when Mrs. Thatcher tried her hand at being funny. She seized the glasses from Sir Geoffrey's nose, placed them on her own, and said, "Doesn't she look like me?" Mr. Portello admits that she did look a bit like Karl Marx's granddaughter, and Geoffrey Howe, blinking without his glasses, was undoubtedly funny. But in Mr. Portello's view, making him look foolish was also rather cruel. Europe, and in particular the idea of linking the pound with the other EEC currencies, was their greatest policy difference. Sir Geoffrey Howe is convinced that, as with Britain's belated membership of the EEC, it would have been far better to have been in at the beginning. The official policy was that Britain would join when the time was right. In practice, Mrs. Thatcher would imply the answer was definitely no and would stay no if she had anything to do with it. After her election landslide in 1983, Mrs. Thatcher replaced the Foreign Secretary Francis Pym, who had recklessly suggested that landslides did not produce good government. Sir Geoffrey Howe, to his delight, was promoted to Foreign Secretary. His keenness that the pound should link up to the other European currencies was no longer directly relevant, but his successor, Nigel Lawson, adopted the same view, much to Mrs. Thatcher's annoyance when she found out. To begin with, the relationship between Mrs. Thatcher and her new Chancellor took on a familiarity which she never managed with Sir Geoffrey. She fussed over Mr. Lawson like a mother hen. She liked his intellectual brilliance and his capacity to take risks. Mr. Lawson in his younger days was thought good-looking. The years had taken their toll, his girth had widened, and there was often a certain untidiness about him which Mrs. Thatcher did her best to rectify. She would be heard telling him to have his hair cut, and Michael Portello tells a story of Mr. Lawson about to set off for a formal ceremony at Buckingham Palace being called back by Mrs. Thatcher and forced to change his shoes. The Prime Minister lent him a pair belonging to her son Mark. Unlike Sir Geoffrey, Mr. Lawson did not seem to mind being fussed over in this way. He took it rightly as a sign of approval. As the election of 1987 approached, Mrs. Thatcher was increasingly prone to treat Sir Geoffrey in a patronising way. I was in the press party which accompanied her to Moscow. She was at the peak of her career, and it was the first time the reforming Soviet president, Mikhail Gorbachev, had welcomed her to Moscow. He was the Russian leader with whom she had declared she could do business. Like many of the famous Thatcher phrases, it was thought up by someone else, in this case Bernard Ingham. Mrs. Thatcher liked the phrase, and it became a convenient cliché to describe the relationship between her and the man who helped to bring about the end of the Soviet Empire. The Moscow trip started badly for me. Aboard the VC-10, Bernard Ingham told us that she would not be coming to see the press party for a while, and so we could tuck in to the luxurious meal provided for us by the RAF. With splendid wines, proper cutlery and napkins, we were beginning to enjoy ourselves. Suddenly Mrs. Thatcher arrived at my elbow. I stood up, as a mark of respect, throwing all the food and crockery onto the floor. The Prime Minister immediately insisted on clearing up the mess. She loved being able to upstage the press. "You stay where you are," she cooed. "I'll sort this out." The implication was clear. You are just another foolish man who has to be rescued by a competent woman. The real embarrassment was, however, reserved for Sir Geoffrey Howe. Soon after the mess on the carpet incident, the Prime Minister literally pulled the Foreign Secretary after her. "Look," she said, clinging to his casual sweater, "what do you think of Geoffrey's new jumper?" It could hardly have been more tactless. The Foreign Secretary being treated like a dummy. One of their cabinet colleagues, Lord Hurd, told me she treated Sir Geoffrey with a total lack of perception. He went on, "He's such a gentle creature. He did nothing to offend her, yet she lashed out at him. And when you consider how he helped her in the early days, and how faithful he had been to her, I think that was very surprising." Lord Hurd believes there were certain people, including Sir Geoffrey, who simply irritated her, and the older she got, the more irritated she became. Years later, a friendly MP asked him how badly he had been treated by her. "It was simply dreadful," he replied. I myself incurred Mrs. Thatcher's wrath later in the trip when I accused her of electioneering. She had been mobbed while touring a housing estate in Moscow. Clearly delighted, she accepted bunches of flowers and signed lots of autographs. It was as if the Tories were fighting a by-election in Moscow North. When I put this to the Prime Minister, I thought she was going to knock me down the 7 flights of stairs to the bottom of an apartment block. "I am simply doing my duty," she snapped, implying that I certainly was not. It is perhaps worth pointing out that the general election was called within a few weeks, and much of Mrs. Thatcher's first election broadcast was taken up with pictures of her being heralded in Moscow. After Mrs. Thatcher had won the 1987 election, a move was announced which alarmed the Eurosceptics. It was agreed that Jacques Delors, the French president of the European Commission, should head a high-powered committee to look into the prospects for economic and monetary union. This was a policy Mrs. Thatcher had tried to block on many occasions, and Mr. Delors was increasingly depicted as Mrs. Thatcher's chief opponent in matters European. With his short stature, his academic manner, and his painfully slow English, Jacques Delors tried to appear reassuring on his regular visits to Number 10. Mrs. Thatcher liked his cleverness, and she liked sparring with him, even though she agreed with The Sun and the Daily Mail that he was a dangerous European federalist who would dearly love to see a United States of Europe. The Sun made clear their opposition with the headline, "Up Yours, Delors," and Mrs. Thatcher was enticed by one of her speechwriters into a tabloid-style riposte. She accused the Commission President of trying to introduce socialism by the back Delors. For her, it was a seminal moment when Mr. Delors was the guest of honour at the TUC conference in September 1988. She was not impressed at the way the union leaders warmed to Frère Jacques, and when Mr. Delors called for a European government and forecast that in 10 years' time 80% of new legislation would come from Brussels, she began preparing for a speech in the Belgian city of Bruges, which she hoped would throw him off course. It was the most Eurosceptic speech she had ever made, and it caused consternation among establishment politicians across Europe. She said, "We have not successfully rolled back the frontiers of the state in Britain, only to see them reimposed at a European level, with a European superstate exercising a new dominance from Brussels." This was her most important speech on Europe during her last few years in office, and for years afterwards the issue was simple. Were you in favour of a European superstate or not? As so often in her career, Mrs. Thatcher had set the terms for the debate. This particular dividing point within the Conservative Party would remain for years to come. Margaret Thatcher had a blind spot about Germany, and this was part of the reason she got on so badly with the German Chancellor Helmut Kohl. It would be wrong to say she did not like foreigners. She had a close relationship with the Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev. When they met for the first time in Moscow, I went with a group of British journalists to see a performance of Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake at the Bolshoi Theatre. The second act was held up for 15 minutes because the two leaders were so deep in conversation that they delayed their return to the ornate box at the back of the stalls. And there were other European leaders, particularly the French President François Mitterrand, with whom she established bonds of respect and admiration. Mr. Mitterrand once said, "She has the eyes of Caligula and the lips of Marilyn Monroe," but I think we should take this as a joke, otherwise the reference to Caligula seems peculiarly insensitive. With Helmut Kohl, though, the electricity never flowed, or if it did, it was polarised in the wrong direction. It may seem trivial, but the sheer size of the German leader did not help. She often seemed to treat him not as a gentle giant, but more the angry troll who should not be appeased. She reserved the right to play Goldilocks. Chancellor Kohl dominated many of the summits. She hated the way he sometimes banged on the table and shouted, making the point that if Germany was going to pay, Germany should get its way. Lord Pole, her chief adviser on foreign affairs, who speaks fluent German, told me it reinforced her instinctive prejudices about Germany as a sort of bullying nation. Chancellor Kohl did try to get on with Mrs. Thatcher. Before their formal meetings, he would always arrive with a generous present, a little brooch or something which he had selected personally. Mrs. Thatcher was unimpressed by the desire of German politicians to subsume their national identity into some kind of federal Europe. Good Germans, as they were sometimes called, were desperate to throw off the image of extreme nationalism. For Chancellor Kohl, with direct memories of the Second World War, his brother was killed in the closing stages, it was a sign of progress and renewal. But Mrs. Thatcher considered that to argue from the special case of the Germans, trying to shake off memories of the Nazis, to the idea that no European country should behave like a sovereign state, was simply wrong-headed and dangerous. This generation of German leaders might be nervous of governing themselves, and therefore want to see the nation-state fade away, but that was certainly no argument for allowing a federal Europe to be established. The immediate question in the spring of 1989 was whether Britain would join the exchange rate mechanism as part of the general move towards European economic and monetary union. Mrs. Thatcher was determined to say no. She was smarting from the way her Chancellor, Nigel Lawson, had secretly tried to make the pound shadow the German Deutschmark as a prelude to entry. She even publicly complained, in a BBC interview, that as a result of this policy inflation had picked up. Privately, Mr. Lawson threatened to resign. Mockery is one of the strongest weapons a politician can use, and if you are in opposition, it can be the most valuable weapon of all. Labour's Shadow Chancellor John Smith knew there was nothing worse for Margaret Thatcher than to be treated as if she was not a serious person. Mr. Lawson, too, liked to be regarded as a brainy heavyweight. During a debate on the economy in June 1989, the two of them had to sit close together on the government front bench, listening to Mr. Smith make them look foolish. It was one of the funniest occasions at Westminster I can remember. Mr. Smith looked like a traditional bank manager, with his dark suit and glasses, and his mischievous sense of humour took people by surprise. Making all he could of the fractious atmosphere in Downing Street, the Shadow Chancellor suggested with mock seriousness that a spirit of good neighbourliness was the only answer to the confusion which lay at the heart of government policy. To heighten the absurdity of his suggestion, he quoted from the words used in the theme tune of Neighbours. It starts in a fairly lofty way, pointing out that everybody needs good neighbours. The mood then becomes more practical. Just a friendly wave each morning helps to make a better day, Mr. Smith repeated, trying to keep a straight face. Neighbours need to get to know each other. Next door is only a footstep away. He peered over his glasses to see if Mrs. Thatcher and Mr. Lawson were taking note. They squirmed in discomfort. With a helpful air, Mr. Smith stressed the words of the final verse. With a little understanding, you can find a perfect blend. Neighbours should be there for one another. That's when good neighbours become good friends. The Commons erupted with gales of laughter. Even the Tories could not hide their amusement. Mrs. Thatcher tried to give the impression that this was simply another boyish prank. She was not angry, she was above it all, and she was certainly not amused. But inside, her determination grew that she would be rid of Mr. Lawson before long. But before this, there was a campaign to fight for the elections to the European Parliament. Mrs. Thatcher wanted to make sure that her new advocacy of Euroscepticism should be fully reflected in the style of the Conservative advertisements. She personally approved the most controversial poster, "Stay at home on June the 15th, and you'll live on a diet of Brussels." The former Conservative Party chairman, Norman Tebbit, described it as the worst election advertising in living memory. The number of Conservative MEPs was reduced from 48 to 35, and the pro-Europeans were quick to blame the party's excessively negative campaign. The result encouraged the Chancellor and the Foreign Secretary to take on Mrs. Thatcher. At a tense formal meeting at Number 10, Sir Geoffrey Howe and Nigel Lawson both told her that unless they could get a serious commitment to join the ERM, they were both prepared to resign. Mrs. Thatcher did not respond directly, and indeed it was not until Sir Geoffrey was sitting in the council meeting in Madrid and listening to her outline the British position that he knew she was prepared to give way. "I can reaffirm today," she declared, "the United Kingdom's intention to join the ERM." Talk of a reshuffle with either or both of them due for the chop soon began to surface. When the reshuffle came the following month, I stood in Downing Street puzzling about why it was taking so long. Mrs. Thatcher had settled for half a loaf. Nigel Lawson would stay as Chancellor, but Sir Geoffrey Howe would be demoted to Leader of the House of Commons. Those bald facts hid a day of dramatic negotiations behind the scenes. Sir Geoffrey had no warning he was about to be sacked, and he was only persuaded not to resign when promised that he would become Deputy Prime Minister. The relatively young and inexperienced John Major was appointed Foreign Secretary. The reshuffle did not solve Mrs. Thatcher's problems. Nigel Lawson had expected he might be sacked or that he might be forced to resign. We had lunch together just before the reshuffle at a select restaurant called Mijano in Victoria. He was extremely discreet. It is one of the myths of these off-the-record lunches that the guest cannot resist blurting out secrets. All too often, the guest is more interested in finding out what other senior politicians are up to. In these circumstances, it sometimes pays to suggest the line your guest might be prepared to take. I suggested to Mr. Lawson that he would like to leave office on a high note, and only if that were possible would he contemplate resignation. In other words, if Mrs. Thatcher wanted him out, she would have to sack him. He nodded in agreement. Mrs. Thatcher and Nigel Lawson differed, not only about policy, but also over who should be allowed to advise the Prime Minister. Professor Sir Alan Walters had returned to Downing Street after being absent for 5 years, and Mrs. Thatcher made no secret of the fact that she increasingly relied on his advice about the economy. Mr. Walters was a radical monetarist, and also very much in tune with Mrs. Thatcher's European views. Mr. Lawson decided that the choice of who should advise the Prime Minister was simple, him or me. He went to see the Prime Minister on October the 26th, 1989, and told her that Mr. Walters would have to go. Mrs. Thatcher listened intently, and then, as expected, dug in her heels. If Alan were to go, that would destroy my authority. She begged him at least to reflect. When he returned later that day, she begged him to stay. I handed her my resignation letter, Mr. Lawson says. At first she refused to take it, but then she took it and popped it into her handbag, unopened, saying that she did not wish to read it. She flattered, she pleaded, but she refused to say the one thing he wanted to hear, that Alan Walters would go. As it happens, I was having lunch that day with John Major. I was sympathising with the hard time the press had given him when Mrs. Thatcher had overruled him at the Commonwealth Conference in Kuala Lumpur. We ended the meal at Mijanu with a bizarre moment when Mr. Major asked me for my advice. I was quite taken aback, not realising this was one of his ways of tempting journalists to look at the situation from his point of view. "Be brave," I said, not knowing he would be thrown further into the fire that very evening. Just after 6 o'clock it was announced that the new Chancellor of the Exchequer would be John Major. When the Berlin Wall came down in November, it seemed that the tough stance Mrs. Thatcher had taken with President Reagan during the Cold War had dramatically paid off. Mrs. Thatcher felt vindicated as well as elated, but she was not happy at the idea that a new, united Germany would arise. Pro-Europeans, including the new Foreign Secretary Douglas Hurd, were shocked at the way Mrs. Thatcher's relations with Chancellor Kohl sank to rock bottom. Lord Hurd told me there were times when Mrs. Thatcher and Chancellor Kohl refused to speak to each other, that vital business had to be conducted at foreign minister level. He said she let personal feelings destroy her relationship with the German leader, and that was a big mistake. For Chancellor Kohl, the last straw was Mrs. Thatcher's opposition to any rapid move towards German unification. Chancellor Kohl wanted to be remembered as the statesman who unified Germany and who had successfully persuaded Europe that Germany no longer wanted to dominate the continent. His differences with Mrs. Thatcher were too great to be bridged, and at Westminster an unlikely challenge was prepared by pro-Europeans. A studied lack of concern was Mrs. Thatcher's response to the leadership challenge, which came a year before the one that finished her off. For 14 years the provision for a contest of this sort had lain dormant, and then along came the wispy figure of Sir Anthony Mayer. Michael Heseltine was already firmly established as the real potential danger to the Prime Minister, but he was careful not to have any direct contact with Sir Anthony. None of this stopped Sir Anthony being referred to throughout the contest, and ever since, as the stalking horse. This description slipped so quickly into the political vocabulary that hardly anyone bothered to find out its origin. Stalking horses were used to deceive deer or game birds. The game did not see any danger in horses, so hunters could hide behind them until they got within easy range. The old Etonian baronet, Sir Anthony Mayer, fitted perfectly into this role. But which hunter was he trying to conceal? Mrs. Thatcher and her loyal colleagues insisted there was no real threat, but when the vote took place, 33 Conservative MPs voted for Sir Anthony, and nearly the same number abstained. It was an ominous sign for Mrs. Thatcher. Her supporters at the party conference had shouted 10 more years, but in reality her life at number 10 would be over in little more than 10 months. Riots, mob rule and anarchy are hardly the words Mrs. Thatcher would like to have associated with her period of government, but they were an unexpected consequence of the policy she was keen to promote as the flagship of her third term. Anger over the poll tax was expressed in many ways. There was nothing, though, to match the explosion of hatred and bitterness which took over the centre of London on March 31st, 1990, the day before the tax was introduced in England and Wales. The organisers estimated that 200,000 took part in the peaceful protest march. Tony Benn made a speech, and feelings were vented in the now traditional shouts of "Maggie, Maggie, Maggie, out, out, out." Then the mood turned nasty. In Whitehall and Trafalgar Square, well over 1,000 people engaged in running battles with the police. The riot spread across the West End. Cars and buildings were set on fire, and shops were looted. It was the worst assault on police and property for more than a century. Amazingly, no one was killed, but about 500 police officers were hurt. They had failed to appreciate the dangers and had moved in too late. At one stage, 7 police officers were trapped in their vehicle, and rioters tried to remove the petrol cap in order to set the van on fire. One of the officers inside said, "It was a baying, screaming mob. I don't think they would have worried too much about killing us." The poll tax was meant to be a fair and simple means of raising revenue for local authorities. Instead of money being paid through rates from each household on the basis of wildly outdated assessments of property values, the tax would be levied on individuals. Everyone would pay, and everyone would therefore be keen to judge whether their local council was delivering worthwhile services. But the basic unfairness of the system could not be overcome. The wealthy landowner would pay as much as the landless tenant. The argument that about half of local government expenditure was covered from general taxation, which did take account of people's ability to pay, carried little weight. Before long, Mrs. Thatcher was the only member of the government ready to argue passionately for the poll tax, officially known as the community charge. At a local government conference in London, she expressed her complete confidence that the system would weed out overspending councils, and she made clear it was Labour councils she had in mind. "Believe you me," she declared, "this is going to transform inner cities, because no longer are they going to be able to spend, spend, spend." Apologists for the poll tax argue that it might have succeeded if the average payment could have been kept at a reasonable level. When the plans were being worked out in 1985, it was thought it would be levied at under £100 a head. By the time the scheme was implemented, the average was heading towards £400. The Conservatives were taking a beating in the opinion polls, and by the time the Great London Riot took place, the poll tax was already looking as if it might wipe out the chances of Mrs. Thatcher winning the next election. Chris Patton believes Mrs. Thatcher made the worst mistake of her career because instead of concentrating properly on domestic issues, he said she was completely focused on the disagreements over ERM with Lawson and Howe. If anyone is looking for a single cause for why Mrs. Thatcher was deposed, the simple answer is this ill-conceived plan to reform domestic rates. But as to why she failed to give it a higher priority, the answer, yet again, is Europe. All roads, it seems, lead to Rome. Mrs. Thatcher, in her last year in office, managed to annoy the Germans, but could do nothing to prevent the success of 2 of Germany's most important policies. On October the 3rd, the new United Germany was proclaimed, and 2 days later, Britain finally joined the exchange rate mechanism. From the spring of 1990, Mrs. Thatcher began to have regular discussions with her new Chancellor, John Major, about whether Britain should join the ERM. To her annoyance, he too was in favour of joining. One of my best scoops as a political journalist was to reveal on the BBC Today programme that a senior member of the Cabinet had told me that Britain would soon join the ERM. As he put it, the Rubicon has been crossed. Because I had been given this information in confidence, I could not reveal that my source was none other than the Chancellor of the Exchequer, John Major. In my interview with Mr. Major in 2003, I suggested that he had managed to persuade Mrs. Thatcher of the case for joining. "Are you suggesting," he replied in mock surprise, "that we have a young, inexperienced Chancellor who in some mysterious way overrules, outmanoeuvres, and outbids a dominant Prime Minister 11 years in office?" His gentle satire could not conceal his bitterness at the way he has been made to take most of the blame. For Mr. Major, the decision to join the ERM remains the greatest mistake of his political life. It destroyed his government's credibility, and he is determined that Mrs. Thatcher should not escape the consequences of what was ultimately her decision. As he emphasized his argument, Mr. Major only just managed to contain his temper, throwing out his points like bullets from a gun. We're told, on the one hand, that Margaret was a master of detail and knew exactly what she was doing, yet here is a subject that she had been discussing for 6 years, and after 6 years this titan of British politics did not understand the subject. Is that a credible proposition? The rising tone of his voice and the baleful glare from behind his glasses made me want to take cover. He seemed to be daring me to contradict him. I did not do so, but I did suggest that Mrs. Thatcher believed the ERM would not be such a rigid system as it later became. He dismissed the idea. "Of course she knew that," he said. "Not a shadow of doubt that she knew that. And indeed, if it wasn't rigid, what would be the point of it?" Mr. Major told me that inflation to Mrs. Thatcher was one of the great evils, hitting the weakest hardest, and in particular small businesses, like her father's shop in Grantham. Every other method had been used to try to bring down inflation. Reluctantly, she concluded the time was finally right to give the ERM a try. In the end, her only objection was over the entry level. She wanted the central rate of exchange to be 3 Deutschmarks to the pound, but she was persuaded that the lower rate of 2.95 would be safer. As it was, the pound was locked into the system at too high a rate. If Mrs. Thatcher had got her way, the eventual devaluation and all that followed would have occurred much sooner. Mr. Major, who was being explicit about this for the first time, said, "So those people who subsequently said she and others warned us of going in at such a high rate are wrong. She wished to go in at a more punitive rate." Britain's entry into the exchange rate mechanism, coupled with the 1% drop in interest rates, was greeted with the kind of euphoria which only comes after a period of stress. Commentators appear to believe that the rather mild figure of John Major had parted the waters of the Red Sea and shown the Conservatives the way out of their difficulties. He was immediately being spoken of as a possible successor to Mrs. Thatcher. In party terms, the timing was impeccable. The announcement came on the last day of the Labour conference, just a few days before the Conservatives were due to meet in Bournemouth. For political correspondents, a lacklustre conference season had come alive. Political pundits have for long derided party conferences as largely stage-managed affairs, which tell you little about the state of British politics. But in my experience, those few days by the seaside, cooped up with the enthusiasts and their often rather less confident leaders, provide a useful way of gauging a party's mood. The Conservative Conference of 1990 was no exception. For a start, there was Mr. Major's speech, which was most unusual for a Chancellor. Instead of concentrating on economic matters, he went into detail about his poor background as a child and why he was a Conservative. It struck me as a clear indication that he thought a vacancy for the leadership might not be far away. Then there was the angry debate about the BBC, a sure sign that a party is unhappy with its image. If I had been able to peer into the future, I would have spent more time following the activities of the two figures later to play such crucial parts in the downfall of Mrs. Thatcher, Sir Geoffrey Howe and Michael Heseltine. Even though Sir Geoffrey was the Deputy Prime Minister, he had not discussed with Mrs. Thatcher the decision to join the ERM. Just before the announcement, a message from Number 10 had been sent to await his arrival at Balmoral, where he was due to start an official visit to the Queen. Sir Geoffrey failed to pick up the message, and so found himself at a loss when the Queen referred to that morning's main news. As he comments dryly in his memoirs, she must have thought it a little odd that the only member of her cabinet who had been dealing with the subject since 1979 was apparently the last to hear of the government's position. In Bournemouth we were not, of course, privy to that extraordinary snub by Mrs. Thatcher. It would have been a political sensation if the story had leaked out, but Sir Geoffrey, loyal to the end, kept it firmly to himself. Michael Heseltine had spent a good deal of energy during the year denying that he was preparing a challenge against Mrs. Thatcher. I went round to see him at the Royal Bath Hotel, and he showed me the speech he would deliver at a fringe meeting. My disappointment that it was not particularly controversial was matched by his satisfaction that I could not portray it as a leadership bid. For some years now I had watched him play this part, and it was as unconvincing as ever. By the end of the week the euphoria of the ERM announcement had disappeared as abruptly as it had arrived. The conference took on a nervous and troubled air. Much would depend on the leader's speech on Friday, and 3 hours before Mrs. Thatcher spoke, the latest inflation figures were released. The inflation rate over the past year had risen to 10.9%, horribly significant in political terms, a higher figure than the 10.3% Mrs. Thatcher inherited from Labour. This sense of déjà vu was reinforced by Mrs. Thatcher's speech. She promised more privatisation, British Rail and the major ports, a tough approach to law and order, and a determined fight against inflation. It appeared as if the Conservative agenda for the 1990s was going to look suspiciously like the Conservative agenda for the 1980s. The way in which Mrs. Thatcher herself seemed to have passed her sell-by date is one of my abiding memories of the occasion. In the last 6 months of 1990, the presidency of the European Union was in the hands of Italy. Not only would this mean that a European summit would be held within its borders, Italy could also apply to hold a special summit if the other member states agreed. The Italians had decided to hold an extra summit with a view to speeding up decisions on economic and monetary union. The special summit was later described as an ambush on Mrs. Thatcher. She was certainly poorly prepared for what happened. All the other member states were keen to demonstrate their support for economic and monetary union. To the dismay of Sir Geoffrey Howe and other pro-European Conservatives, Mrs. Thatcher made no secret of her implacable opposition. During interviews she gave in Rome, the Prime Minister dismissively described her European colleagues as on their way to cloud cuckoo land. She insisted that Britain would veto the very idea of a single currency. When news of what she had said was broadcast, I was phoned at home by the political editor of the BBC, my old friend John Cole. Normally we were scrupulous when discussing news stories not to express our own political views. This time he asked me bluntly, "What do you think?" I was careful not to react too strongly, but I did say, "I think she's gone too far." When the Prime Minister reported back to the Commons on the outcome of the summit, she appeared not in the least downhearted. It was on this occasion that she gave her famous reply of no, no, no to a question on the possibility of increased powers for the European institutions. But it was the way she poured a bucket of cold water on the British proposal for currency reform which so enraged Sir Geoffrey and indeed John Major. The new Chancellor had been promoting what was called the hard echo. The idea was that businesses would be able to choose to avoid some of the risks of currency fluctuations by dealing in an artificial currency similar to the echo. Mr. Major was originally able to sell the idea to Mrs. Thatcher because the system would be entirely voluntary. It could be called a common currency, but it was certainly not a single currency. Mrs. Thatcher, becoming increasingly intemperate as she answered questions in the Commons, made it quite clear she had no faith in her own government's proposal. "In my view," she said, "it would not become widely used. I do not believe that will happen." Mr. Major admitted years later what a blow this had been. "I nearly fell off the bench," she said. With this single sentence she wrecked months of work and preparation. It was as if something inside the Prime Minister had snapped. She accused the European Commission of striving to extinguish democracy. She railed against the danger of a federal Europe, and she insisted it would be utterly wrong to abolish the pound because it was the greatest expression of sovereignty. Most of her cabinet were startled more by the stridency of her attack than by what she actually said. Her views were given all the more prominence because after years of wrangling the Commons had agreed to be televised. On the BBC 6 o'clock news that evening I had a feast of pictures and comment. Privately I was shaken by what had happened. It seemed as if all the usual conventions of diplomacy had been thrown onto a bonfire. 2 days after her flare-up in the Commons, Sir Geoffrey Howe held a formal meeting with the Prime Minister at No. 10. As he stood there, she read his resignation letter and concluded, "I can see now why we shouldn't be able to change your mind." For the first time Sir Geoffrey could remember they shook hands. His letter made clear that their key differences were over European policy. The important thing is not to rule in or out any one particular solution absolutely, he wrote. In her letter in reply, Mrs. Thatcher was oddly reluctant to concede a major rift between them. But that was not her mood when Sir Geoffrey had the chance to make his resignation speech in the Commons. Nigel Lawson sat next to him as a sign of support. It was the most dramatic, the most devastating attack on a sitting Prime Minister that anyone could remember. Much of its force stemmed from the fact that for years Sir Geoffrey had been ultra-loyal. He never usually raised his voice or displayed his temper. Now he turned on Mrs. Thatcher with a cool savagery that left his colleagues literally gasping. One of them could be seen on television wincing as each blow was struck. The Prime Minister tried to look composed. She later admitted to being shocked. She said it was like being put in the dock for a capital offence. Sir Geoffrey began in a fairly low key, speaking of the exchange rate mechanism and how it would have been preferable if the government had followed Mr. Lawson's advice and gone in 5 years earlier. The present high inflation might have been avoided. His mood hardened. He became personal, suggesting that the Prime Minister conjured up a nightmare image of a Europe positively teeming with ill-intentioned people scheming, in her words, to extinguish democracy. As for the Prime Minister's rejection of her government's proposal for a hard echo, Sir Geoffrey was scathing. It is rather like sending your opening batsmen to the crease only for them to find, the moment the first balls are bowled, that their bats have been broken before the game by the team captain. The Prime Minister's perceived attitude towards Europe, he said, threatened to minimise our influence. If we detach ourselves completely, as a party or a nation, from the middle ground of Europe, the effects will be incalculable and very hard ever to correct. Sir Geoffrey ended on an ominous note which many took to be a call to arms. The time has now come for others to consider their own response to the tragic conflict of loyalties with which I have myself wrestled for perhaps too long. The next day Michael Heseltine took the most important decision of his life. For a politician often described as a man of destiny, there was something irresistible about this challenge. It went against the conclusion he had reached that he would best be served waiting for her to resign, perhaps after she had lost the next election. He could see the dangers as clearly as anyone. Just 2 days after Sir Geoffrey's resignation speech, Mr. Heseltine announced that he would fight Mrs. Thatcher for the leadership of the Conservative Party. One of the most surprising elements in the story of Mrs. Thatcher's removal from office is the ease with which she was forced into a formal contest for the leadership. It is as if the front door of the victim's home was left deliberately open on the night of the murder. The Conservative Party were acting according to the rules operating at the time. As often happens in politics, it was an accident of history. These rules had been designed 25 years earlier to address a very different problem. Inasmuch as anyone was personally responsible for making up these rules, this dubious honour goes to a young Conservative MP, Humphrey Barclay, whose subsequent career hardly endeared him to the Tories. He left the Conservatives, joined Labour, left Labour, and joined the Social Democratic Party, and finally rejoined Labour. The journalist Alan Watkins describes him as having a scornful expression and a superior manner, and he supports this description with an alarming story of how Mr. Barclay was leaving a Chinese restaurant with the political commentator Anthony Howard. Noticing that his shoelace was undone, Mr. Barclay summoned a waiter and asked him to retie it. Mr. Howard was so embarrassed that he knelt down and took over the task himself. It is not always the most deserving who make history. The Conservatives were slow to embrace the concept of internal party democracy. When Harold Macmillan resigned as Prime Minister in 1963, there was no question of choosing his successor by a formal election. Lord Hume, who renounced his peerage to become plain Sir Alec Douglas Hume, emerged from a series of consultations carried out by senior members of the party. Supporters of other possible candidates were appalled. Sir Alec's appeal to the general public was far less effective than that of his rival, Harold Wilson, who was being skillfully promoted as an HP sauce-loving beer drinker with an impeccable northern accent. Mr. Wilson kept his enjoyment of cigars and brandy away from the public gaze and the fact that he had been an Oxford academic before becoming an MP. Sir Alec became annoyed at the way Mr. Wilson kept calling him the 14th Earl of Hume, and famously replied that he was the 14th Mr. Wilson. But after Labour won the election of 1964, the Tories decided democracy should be given a chance. Humphrey Barclay, a keen supporter of the ablest of Sir Alec's rivals, Ian MacLeod, was sufficiently upset by the exclusion of his hero to mount a campaign for reform. An obsessive letter writer, he managed to win over Sir Alec to his cause and eventually produced what became known as the Barkley Memorandum, which was accepted as the basis for the voting system. It had one strange element, which would only become crucially important in the vital vote which brought down Mrs. Thatcher. On the first ballot, and only on the first ballot, the winning candidate would have to gain not only a simple majority, but an additional 15% more of the total votes cast. When Sir Edward Heath became leader, he accepted one of Mr. Barclay's original suggestions for an annual election. The indefatigable Mr. Barclay explained the point was that Ted thought he would win, so he was not worried about an annual challenge. Given the antipathy between Sir Edward and Mrs. Thatcher, it is tempting to jump to the conclusion that he would have been pleased to introduce the rule which finished her off as leader. That is, if one forgets that until Mrs. Thatcher was challenged in 1989, the only other time a Conservative leader had been called to defend themselves in an annual contest was when Mrs. Thatcher took on Sir Edward and won. The BBC were accused of irresponsibility by the founder of the SDP, David Owen, when they ran a report of mine suggesting the strong chances of another leadership election. The story was broadcast a week after Sir Geoffrey Howe resigned, but before his devastating resignation speech. It was on the day Mrs. Thatcher announced the practical details of when the election would take place. The details of the arrangements turned out to be highly significant, because it was the Prime Minister herself who decided that she would be in Paris on November 20th, the day the first ballot would be held. She would be there for the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, bringing together all the main world leaders to celebrate the end of the Cold War. I believe she chose that setting in order to be able to play down the significance of any vote that was cast in London. She would be on the world stage, and people like me who concentrated on the politics of Westminster would be made to look peripheral against the background of such a momentous occasion. When Mrs. Thatcher made the arrangements for the election, she did not know that Sir Geoffrey Howe was about to make the speech of his life, or that Mr. Heseltine would feel duty-bound to challenge her. The political world had been suddenly transformed, and Mrs. Thatcher made the biggest tactical mistake of her career by not properly appreciating the enormity of that change. Mrs. Thatcher's leadership campaign hardly deserves that description. Given there was a threat to the position of the head of government, it may seem odd that the resources of government were not put at the Prime Minister's disposal. But in the British system, a distinction, not always a clear one, is made between government activity and party politics. A Conservative leadership election falls definitely into the category of party politics. Civil servants, including Sir Bernard Ingham, would be expected to have nothing to do with the matter. The most significant consequence of this division is that Mrs. Thatcher was not allowed to employ the usual method for ensuring her support. The government whip's office. Mrs. Thatcher's campaign was lacking the two ingredients which had served her so well in the past: her personal involvement and a dedicated, skillful team. The Prime Minister was poorly served by those who were put in charge of her ad hoc organisation. They made the classic mistake of courtiers. They told her what she wanted to hear. Many MPs lied about whether they would support her, but her campaign managers should have made allowance for the natural duplicity of politicians when the ballot is secret. It was an exhilarating time to be a political correspondent, with rumour fast replaced by counter-rumour, and everyone thrilled at the chance of playing a part, however small, in a moment of history. Mrs. Thatcher's parliamentary private secretary, Peter Morrison, did not behave as if his role mattered as much as it did, and afterwards he would be overcome by remorse. The great diarist Alan Clark describes how he went to see Mr. Morrison the day before the vote. After his usual fairly liquid lunch, Mr. Morrison was snoring lightly in his leather armchair. This was the most critical day of the election, Mr. Clark wrote in his diary, describing how he woke him up and told him how worried he was about the way things were going. A bleary Mr. Morrison replied, "Do you think I'd be like this if I wasn't entirely confident?" Pressed on the actual calculations the campaign team had made, Mrs. Thatcher's parliamentary aide was a little less sure. "I've got Michael on 115, he said. "It could be 124 at the worst." That would have enabled Mrs. Thatcher to win easily on the first ballot. The Labour leader, James Callaghan, used to reflect ruefully on his time at Number 10, and in particular on how long it took for a Prime Minister to get out of touch. A few weeks, it might be suggested. "A few days," he would reply with a smile. A Prime Minister cocooned within the government machine often knows little about the feelings of ordinary MPs. In Mrs. Thatcher's final leadership campaign, Mr. Morrison had a harder task than normal because of the often entirely unhelpful attitude of Mrs. Thatcher herself. Andrew Turnbull, her principal private secretary, believes that she simply could not accept the legitimacy of a challenge to her leadership. He told me, "She thought, I am the most famous politician in the world, and I have won all these elections. Now what on earth is this about?" Sir Bernard Ingham remembers her saying to him that she had no intention of grubbing for votes in the gutter. "If they don't know who they are voting for by now, they never will," she said. The loyal Sir Bernard is puzzled by her performance in the leadership battle. He wonders if there is a secret explanation. The point is that she was a fighter, and she didn't fight. It was out of character. When the result of the leadership ballot was announced just after 6:15 p.m. on November the 20th, 1990, I was standing in the courtyard in front of the short flight of steps leading to the entrance of the British Embassy in Paris. It had rained for much of the day, and the gravel was wet underfoot. The whole area was lit with television lights, giving the scene the dramatic intensity of a stage set. I'd earlier told viewers that the Prime Minister had been showing some signs of strain, but her camp had expressed complete confidence that she would win. The result, read out in London in a Commons Committee room, was immediately coupled with the comment, "second ballot." It was a heart-stopping moment. The figures were Thatcher 204, Heseltine 152, abstentions 16. The Prime Minister had been caught by that weird rule requiring a majority plus 15%. If only 2 more MPs had stayed loyal to their leader, she would have won. All those who had worried about her lack of campaigning effort were instantly vindicated. I thought this indecisive result, neither victory nor rejection, would delay Mrs. Thatcher's public reaction. I suggested to a member of her staff that she would not be coming out straight away. He emphatically agreed, and I announced to the 13 million viewers that her appearance would be delayed. I had not been informed of the closely thought-out plan which then went into operation. It had been agreed by Mrs. Thatcher and her advisers that if she were forced into a second ballot, she could not afford to wait for a moment. She would have to seize the initiative and immediately announce her determination to stay in the race. She received the news of the ballot in a small upstairs room at the British Embassy, sitting by a dressing table. Among the group of senior staff was her parliamentary private secretary Peter Morrison, who took the phone call from London. He wrote down the figures and handed the note to the Prime Minister. His comment, "It's not as good as we hoped," said it all. Her faithful press secretary, Bernard Ingham, told me that as ever she was icily controlled. She stood up and said, "Well, I know what I have to do then." She made for the lift, followed by Mr. Ingham. They had to negotiate an extremely slippery marble staircase, and he was concerned that she might fall over. But she didn't hesitate. She did not wait for Mr. Ingham to check that all the arrangements were in place. She went straight through the front door and down the steps to where I was waiting. Having just announced that she would not be coming out for some time, I was blissfully unaware that she had suddenly appeared. My earpiece had not conveyed to me the startled cry of Peter Sisson's, "She's behind you!" Only when a photographer leapt into the air did I risk turning round. I saw a small group bearing down on me, Mr. Ingham, Mrs. Thatcher, and the No. 10 official who told me she would not be coming out. They were looking for a microphone, but it was not the one I was holding in my hand. It was a wonderfully chaotic scene. "Here is the microphone," I protested, pushing my microphone forward. Having given up hope of finding the proper microphone, they decided mine would have to do, and the Prime Minister delivered her prepared statement. "I am naturally very pleased," she said, "that I got more than half the parliamentary party, and disappointed that it's not quite enough to win on the first ballot. So I confirm that it is my intention to let my name go forward for the second ballot." Refusing to take any questions, she swept back into the embassy. It became one of the most famous scenes in the history of television news, a brilliant BBC exclusive. End of Disc 2.